Welcome to another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. I'm Dan Proft, co-host of Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, weekdays 5 to 9 a.m. And with me, as our guest on this edition, is a young man who's burst onto the scene as perhaps one of America's newest public intellectuals. He is Zach Wood, just recently graduated from Williams College. He's the author of this book, Uncensored, which is sure to be a New York Times bestseller. Zach, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I became familiar with you when you testified before Congress about a year ago, and it was about free speech on campus, and the campus of Williams College. And you were the head of a student group at Williams College called Uncomfortable Learning.
Yes.
And the idea was what?
The idea behind Uncomfortable Learning is that you know you're on a predominantly liberal campus, and it's important for students to be exposed to a range of viewpoints. And so you bring speakers whom you know are provocative, whom you know are controversial, and whom you hope will push students to kind of rethink their own firmly held beliefs.
And so that this is what you and other students at Williams were doing.
Yep.
And so how did it get from, which seems to be sort of, at least once upon a time, was an uncontroversial position, that the free marketplace of ideas, incubator of thought and discussion, that's what a college campus is supposed to be, but this became something controversial at Williams that led you all the way to testimony before Congress.
Exactly. So part of it is that there is, it's not just that campuses are predominantly liberal, it's that the next step for progressivism on college campuses was moving from not just the idea of increasing the presence of minorities, but making sure that everyone feels welcome and included. And that runs into some speech issues, mainly because if the goal is to have everyone feel welcome and included, and a student says, having so-and-so speak, right, having Charles Murray speak or Christina Hoff Sommers speak, well, that doesn't make me feel welcome. Then that's where the issue of inclusion clashes with the ideal of free expression.
And it also clashed
with what I thought we needed.
And versus what the president of Williams College thought
exactly. We needed. Yeah. So Adam Falk was the president of Williams at the time, and it was his view that it was important to make sure that students felt safe on campus, that they felt as though they
felt safe on the campus of Williams College.
Felt safe on the campus of Williams College.
Right.
Which
that's not a punchline.
That's not a punchline, right?
No.
So I mean, it was his understanding that John Derbyshire, who was a former writer for the National Review, crossed the line. That there were things that he said that were inflammatory, that were incendiary, that Williams College students simply shouldn't have to be exposed to. It's
a funny thing too, because I know some of the research arguments that Derbyshire made that got him in trouble at National Review, ultimately got him terminated from National Review. And there was discussions among conservatives back and forth, some sort of defending what he was saying. He was just laying out some data, others suggesting that the implications were beyond the pale.
Exactly.
So there was robust discussion at National Review about Derbyshire and in conservative circles, but for that to spill over onto the campus of Williams was a bridge too far.
It was too far, right? So I mean, he thought what he was saying was not just categorically racist and offensive, but that it was something that would have a detrimental effect on Williams students psychologically, emotionally, that it would make it so that they were less capable or incapable of doing what they're there to do.
And did you try and forge a compromise with the president of Williams College like they did at Middlebury, where we're going to have Charles Murray come and speak, but you're allowed to attack your professors physically if he comes on campus?
I wish I would have had the opportunity to actually sit down with Adam Falk face to face and kind of hash out where our differences were in this issue. But he actually deliberately avoided me in numerous encounters on campus. I remember one time, this was at a basketball game. I walked up, my hand was extended, President Falk, how are you? And he turns around and he just walks away, immediately after making eye contact with me. So that's not really setting a great example for
robust intellectual engagement.
How to handle a disagreement, right? Exactly, right? So, I thought set a bad precedent.
Yeah, I would say. But what does that say about college campuses, Williams and others? Because there are examples of, even erstwhile social justice leftists being mugged by reality. You think Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State, for example.
I do think it's important to point out that it's complicated and that each campus is a little different. Williams is really small. We're talking 2,300 students. That's 560 or so people in my graduating class.
And most of them are relatives of Bill Bennett.
You know, I mean, in a sense, I mean, the thing is you've got a very vocal minority on campus. And that vocal minority fiercely opposes uncomfortable learning. At the same time, though, you have a silent majority that is not only sympathetic to it, but sees some value in it. The issue is they don't feel comfortable speaking up. Because on campuses, if you speak up and you say that, if you say uncomfortable learning is interesting, compelling, I've gotten something from it, or simply I just want to learn more about it, well, you're going to have to deal with backlash on social media. You're going to have to deal with being in a small, more intimate space and community, because Williams is small, seeing the same people every day, walking into the dining hall as I have, and every head turns in your direction. And
so the irony of the tolerant, self-styled tolerant being intolerant is lost on them.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's you know, there are some, for those on campus who are among the most radical, I truly do believe that they mean well. What they desire is what they see as a more just world. And there are some things that they're pushing for that I support. The issue is, for me primarily, is how they go about expressing that view, how they engage, or the lack of engagement with those whom they know they deeply disagree with.
And so we're in this sort of curious era of redefining words and also making words that are not synonymous. Yeah. So tolerance is not synonymous with acceptance, right. Much less adherence. But it seems like on college campuses, for the cultural Marxist set, the academicians as well as the students, tolerance is a synonym for acceptance, and you will just not accept this. You're going to be a cheerleader, otherwise you're going to face the mob. Exactly.
There's a lot of concept creep, right? There's a difference. Another example is the difference between language that is offensive and then this association that's being made with language as violence. I don't buy it. I think violence is violence. And I think language can be offensive, it can be inflammatory, it can be incendiary, it can be bad speech you don't support. Right? I mean, I think this concept of hate speech is valid and valuable, and we should examine it. I think the First Amendment protects it, but we should examine it and think about, what does it mean? When people say hate speech, what are they talking about? Why is it difficult for people to engage with? But the idea that speech is violence and therefore should be censored or shut down or banned, I don't buy it. I think it's kind of a logical fallacy.
So, so speaking of something that perhaps is synonymous, this is a question. Is uncomfortable learning, the name of your student group and your sort of disposition, is that a synonym for learning? It's just learning has become uncomfortable.
It's right. I mean, it really is a synonym for learning. I think, in some sense, I don't see how you can really learn about something that you don't already know or that you're not already familiar with if it's going to be entirely comfortable for you, right? I mean, reading a great novel, in some sense, should push you or challenge you. Reading a great philosophical work should do the same thing. Well, engaging with political issues, whether it's abortion or gun rights or affirmative action or welfare, that's tough stuff.
Should we be concerned, I mean, speaking as a young man, should we be concerned that so many of those individuals in your age cohort that think that they have learned everything that they need to learn and that all the debates are over?
I think we should be very concerned because, there are those issues out there upon which a majority of Americans probably think are already conclusively decided upon. Should women have the right to vote? I think that's conclusively decided upon. But there are other issues. How do we deal with social mobility, inequality, economic opportunity? Those, there's a debate to be had there.
Well, right? Sure, but even debates that you think that are settled issues.
Yeah, sure.
Women's suffrage, settled issues.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But if somebody wanted to come on the campus of my alma mater, Northwestern, and make the case that we should go back to pre-suffrage, that women should not have the right to vote.
Sure.
You can make the case. I'm happy to entertain it.
And so my thing is this. I think that person, I'm going to defend their right to speak if they're invited. I personally, myself, am going to invite someone who's saying something that I find to be a bit more socially relevant, right? So something related to race or related to class or related, with regard to gender, to intersectional feminism, let's say.
Well, right? Sure. I mean, so, that may be more salient.
Exactly.
But I mean, but some of the most interesting intellectual exercises, like seeing a conservative and libertarian argue about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln.
Now, that'd be good.
right? And so the libertarian will take the position that Lincoln wasn't one of our best presidents; he was one of our worst presidents because of what he did to essentially codify the centrality of the federal government.
Right.
And so that it's an esoteric argument.
It is, but I can see that being.
But so I mean, the idea that that anybody has figured out all the questions, all the positions is this person or this issue is branded this way in my mind, and so I'm not interested in what anybody else has to say on the topic that doesn't comport with the viewpoint I've already formed. That is the height of ignorance and arrogance, which is a dangerous intersection. A lot of accidents there.
It's really problematic. I think one way of addressing it, though, I think we have to go beyond identifying it as problematic, and we have to try to assess and sort of build an understanding of why it is this way. So I talked about the kind of trend, right, on the left, that it's beyond now just increasing the presence of minorities. It's about inclusion and about people feeling welcomed. Beyond that, I think we've got to think about the effect of social media, right? How is that affecting the way in which millennials are perceiving and understanding these issues, discussing these issues, right? What is Twitter? What's the effect of Twitter? I think Twitter has some very useful purposes. I have it myself. But I think, is it really helping us have serious, thoughtful conversations about these issues? Well, I think in many ways it can detract. It can make it a lot easier to just mobilize bias in ways that are unproductive. So we have to think about social media. We also have to think about the effect of, for instance, for minority students. If you're watching the news and what you see on TV every day are instances of police brutality, and you're not looking at the evidence or you're not looking at broader trends, then it can look like, right, this is only getting worse and worse and worse and worse, right? When what's really different is that people have phones now and things are being recorded, right? So there are those subtle distinctions and differences that we have to pay attention to and think about how we can incorporate that in the conversation. Do
you think that maybe part of this discussion and raising issues and concerns and potential problem areas, the channels of discourse, that a baseline should be established that what you should try to get to is a point where you cannot be offended. Forget, because what we have now is people looking to be offended.
Right.
What we have now is people, at Williams College and other kind of elite universities or rarefied environments,
right.
Multi-cajillionaires in Silicon Valley, who are just so delicate that a cross word and they descend into a puddle of tears. It's absurd. Don't be offended. Take serious ideas seriously. Take how we order a free society and treat one another seriously. Don't take yourself seriously.
I think a lot of that is good. With respect to people not being offended, I think there's a sense in which that might be a bit unnatural. There are some things that are just going to offend people.
Well, right? Sure, but not to the point of shutting everything down.
That I totally agree with. Right? You can be offended by something or find something extremely problematic and say, okay, instead of going to this event and just trying to disrupt the speaker, I'm going to argue with the speaker. I'm going to ask a tough question. We're going to have this debate, right? I'm going to raise my objection, right, in the form of a difficult question. Those are more productive, I think, fruitful ways of having the kind of conversations that I've been pushing for. So I agree. I don't think if you're offended by something, you're offended by it. But the way to deal with it is not to say, hey, you shouldn't be here.
Well, right. I mean, and it just, we get to the point of these absurdities. Brandeis University, named after Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who famously said that the cure to speech you don't like, paraphrasing, is more speech.
Yep.
Disinvited Ayaan Hirsi Ali from giving a speech at Brandeis University because they didn't want to hear speech they didn't like.
Yep.
I mean, so the those who inherited the deep thinking of seminal intellects like Louis Brandeis, just casting him aside. You're in a sense, you're rewriting history.
Exactly.
Eliminating history. It's like everything is new in 2018.
Right.
And that's dangerous too.
Not having that sense of history is a big factor as well. And I think another thing is, I mean, listen, I was going to private school since 4th grade. I was receiving a great education. But free speech, I actually didn't discuss that in my AP US history course. I didn't discuss that in other history courses I was taking. I think that's something we have to think about too. Civic education. How can we make it so that college students get to college and they have an understanding of why the First Amendment is important. Because right now, one of the biggest issues I've noticed is that a lot of student activists see the First Amendment as something that they need to be opposed to because it in some way works against them.
Or
they don't see it as an asset.
Or it only applies to groups that are
Exactly.
specially designated
Exactly.
as victims. It doesn't apply to white male oppressors.
Exactly. Right. So, I mean, it's important that you have a robust understanding of philosophically why is the First Amendment important, and how does it tie into dissent in a democracy and citizenship in society?
Now, I know I mean, this is sort of important to note, is you don't identify as conservative. I don't know where you identify yourself in terms of the ideological spectrum.
I'm a liberal Democrat. There are many progressive causes I support.
Okay. So how do you square your liberal Democrat identification with your position on free speech? Because you're sort of at odds with the prevailing winds.
You know, I think it's interesting, right? I think what we're noticing on college campuses, it's concerning. There are instance after instance reveals the ways in which speech is being threatened. But I think if you were to go to our political figures, if you were to go to Congress, I don't think there are many congressmen or women on the left or right who would say to you, you know, I don't support free speech. Now, there are some who would want to restrict and delay. Yeah, you know, so they understand that, you know, there is an understanding that this is something it's fundamental, right? But, you know, the way in which I square it is, you know, I want to hear what people have to say. I want to understand the nuances of those I'm engaged with, those I want to be able to work together with. I'm interested in finding common ground. I'm interested in seeing the humanity in those I deeply disagree with. And I think that building that understanding, it's kind of ever evolving in a sense, will enable me to be a better change agent in the future.
So what's the basis for your liberal Democrat identification?
So the basis is I believe in social insurance against catastrophe, right? I believe not just in having a social safety net. I believe the government has to play a significant role in providing opportunity and access for those who don't have it, that there are certain structural inequities that the government has to address for youth in the community that I come from, for example.
So now then, what should we do about the male gap in higher education? With
the male gap,
57% of BAs are earned by women.
Yeah,
there's about a 25-point spread in aggregate number of undergraduate degrees earned by women versus men.
Right.
It's the same thing with master's degrees, with the exception of a few areas like some of the hard sciences and engineering. And so if the numbers were reversed, I suspect those who identify on your side of the spectrum would be calling this a national crisis. So why isn't it a national crisis when it's the other way if we're just going to do gender identification?
Right. So you're saying why isn't it a problem?
Yeah. What should we do about it? I mean, if the government is in the business of making sure everything comes out 50-50.
Well, no, that's so I don't think the government should be in the business of making sure it's not about quotas. It's not about proportionality. It's about making sure that boys and girls who are in impoverished communities, right, in which the schools are dilapidated, in which they may not have two parents in the home, have access to things that allow them to envision a better future. That's where I believe the government should play a critical role. When it comes to affirmative action, the reason why I support affirmative action is because I believe just like it's important to have intellectual diversity and political diversity, you should also have diversity across class, socioeconomic status, across race, and across gender. But I do not think that affirmative action should mean, you know, that you have to have proportionality or that outcomes necessarily have to reflect the desire to increase diversity.
So since Brown v. Board, the last almost 65 years now, how's the government been doing?
I think we've been doing better. I think there's been incremental progress. I think that the presence of minorities in elite institutions, whether it be higher education or corporate settings, is increasing. I think we can do better. I think the conversation, if we're talking about on campus, right, the tension between inclusion and expression, that's something that we have to really think about rigorously. How is it that we can promote inclusion and make sure that students who come from a background like my own feel as though they can fully engage with difficult issues, yet also at the same time understand and accept the fact that there are going to be students who think things, and there are going to be speakers who say things, and professors who articulate things that the majority of people on campus might really disagree with.
Do you think that government and those in power of elite cultural institutions, which are almost without exception men and women of the left, fellow travelers, very little intellectual diversity, do you think that in big urban centers and in elite institutions they have fostered more integration or less? As we moved from de jure segregation to de facto segregation, Chicago. Yeah. Chicago is, we don't have Jim Crow in Chicago, right, but you wouldn't know it the way that communities are segregated by neighborhood in this city.
Right. Well, I mean, there are a lot of things that go on. You've got gentrification, there are a number of sociological and structural factors that are at work. I think it depends upon what institution you're looking at, whether or not there's greater integration now. I think broadly in American society, with respect to the issue of race, with respect to issues of inclusion and including people of different cultures and different backgrounds, I think we're doing far better now than we were doing in 1960. I think we've got a ways to go, and I think the conversation now is at such a place where it's more nuanced than it was then. It was, people weren't drinking at the same water fountain.
Well,
right?
Of course,
it's different,
of course, but no, but in a sense, because it's more nuanced, because it's below the fold, because we have laws now. People say, well, we have these laws, so everything's fine.
Exactly.
Well, everything's not fine.
Exactly.
And so when it comes to, say, K through 12 education, which is of course the incubator for the pathway to success at the higher ed level or in the job market and in independent, successful life, you were able to go to private school because your parents sacrificed for you.
Exactly.
What do you think about big urban school systems, their performance, and whether or not, again, in terms of government, the idea of tax credits and scholarships and other vehicles to give access to people who are poor in big cities generally, who are disproportionately minority, not exclusively. What do you think about something like that?
So I actually am a big proponent of school choice, but I've got one issue with it. Mm-hmm. One big issue is that you have these good charter schools who have not conveyed really an interest in, have not demonstrated a commitment to taking those students who tend to be the toughest to teach. That, I think, is something we really need to think about. Because if we're talking about children, right, I mean, they're only so responsible for the circumstances in which they're, right, you don't choose who your parents are, you don't choose the neighborhood you're born in. We have to think about how to make sure that the students who end up going to these charter schools are not just the ones who are the highest achieving or the ones who are the most motivated or the ones who've done well on standardized test scores, right? And that is a more complicated conversation. With respect to public schools, I don't think that just because, I believe in charter schools, I believe in school choice, but
charter schools, by the way, are public schools.
Right, they are public schools technically, but I'm talking about public schools that are under-resourced, right? We shouldn't forget about those that are significantly under-resourced, that tend to be more decrepit in terms of how they look, that don't have libraries. For instance, when I went to a public school in Detroit in 3rd grade, it was one of the better schools in the city, and it didn't have a library. What kind of message is that sending? Students?
Well, right. If you look at the actual inputs into these systems versus the outputs,
right.
Under-resourced, maybe resources are being misappropriated.
So that's what I was going to say. I don't think it's just a matter of dumping more money into a system. I think it's about allocation. Mm-hmm. I think it's about teacher training. I think we should value teachers more. That doesn't mean I agree with all of the grievances and concerns that are being put forward by teachers' unions. I think some of them are valid, and we really need to consider those. But I think that we can do a better job training, right, teachers, and we have to look at avenues there. And then we have to think about what are certain steps that can be taken to improve schools, public schools that are not like KIPP, right?
Well, okay, fair enough. But sticking on this point, we have a system that exists right now where you have public and private competition and the resources are attached to the kids. It's called college.
Yeah.
And I take my GI Bill, I take my Stafford loan, I take my Pell Grant, and I go to Notre Dame, I go to Illinois State, I go to Williams, I go wherever I want to go, based on where I can get into. If that system works at the collegiate level, why should we apply it down the line at K through 12?
You're saying why shouldn't we?
Why shouldn't we? Because we don't.
Right. Well, I think it's, in terms of why we aren't as a society, frankly, and this is a problem that I have with the left, I think that there are a lot of politicians, senators, state senators, right, congressmen, who understand that school choice is the right thing to support. They understand the value.
Yeah.
They understand the benefits. Not that there aren't any costs, but they understand the benefits. And the reason why they don't support it is because there are many teachers' unions who strongly support their candidacies.
Right.
That I really think is the practical issue, right? So, I mean, I'm with you on that in terms of taking that on down to K through 12.
All right. Well, so you got like 14 years to be the nominee for the Democratic
Right,
Party
exactly.
for president,
And, yeah.
to break the
Exactly.
100-year cycle of
Exactly.
being tethered to the teachers' union.
Right.
I noticed on your book here, a friend of the show, a friend of my show, Juan Williams,
Yeah.
liberal Democrat, big
Yeah.
school choice proponent.
Yeah.
He gets the scam.
He does, exactly.
And so,
I mean, is it about kids or is it about teachers,
Well, right. I mean, we know it's about the adults in the system.
Right, exactly.
So,
And I'm not saying, I think that there are teachers, I can remember when I was in public schools in the inner city, it was clear that they cared. It was
No, of
clear that they
course.
valued their work.
sure.
But it's tough. You're dealing with lots of issues that are outside the bounds of the school, and we have to think about how to address those as well. That's why I think it's important to have things like, better jobs training programs, not just increasing the number, increasing the efficacy of what we have.
Yeah, don't you
Right.
see this? I mean, in part, I would think that Trump's election is properly understood as a rejection of systems that don't deliver what they promise to deliver at exorbitant prices. And K through 12 education is a good example of that. It's not about good people, and it's not about well-intentioned people, and it's not about a lot of good teachers in public schools, so stipulated. It's about a system that is set up Soviet style and therefore incapable, structurally incapable of producing what it promises to produce. No amount of money and no amount of talent is going to change that, because what do we know about the forces of organization? Competition produces better goods and services at lower costs, and the K through 12 exemption is mystifying because it's not a performance-based one.
So two things. So I think that Trump's election reflects a few factors, a few things. I think that's one of them. I think you also have the fact of, if Trump didn't win, we were going to have the first woman president. I think that's a factor.
Hillary Clinton was a woman?
We're on the heels of the first African American president. I think that having the first black president and then having a first woman president, in some sense, represents a kind of destabilizing social change that some Americans who value traditional values, might not have been ready to accept. I also think there are economic grievances that were not addressed in places like the Rust Belt, places like Appalachia. And I think that's reflected in something like J.D. Vance's memoir. There are people who felt left out.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's also a factor. So I think it's a bit more complex as to what explains Trump's election.
Sure.
To go to your other point, I do believe that our democratic institutions, political and economic institutions, have the resources and the mechanisms to address some of these problems. I think one of the issues is political polarization, party sorting, and the fact that Congress isn't really, it's the opposite of progress right now. They're not really getting a lot done, right? So it's our system of government, our legislative branch it's certainly not at its best right now. And so I think we have to think about political polarization, what the effects are, and how do we counter that?
Well, as somebody who does have an understanding of this history of the country and brings historical context to these issues, this wasn't supposed to be the way our founders set up this representative republic. They had sort of an understanding of man's nature being fallen.
It was Madison who said if men were angels, we wouldn't need government, right?
Right.
But men aren't angels.
So checks and balances.
Oh, yeah.
We want this thing to be laborious and difficult.
Yes.
We don't want this to be,
Right.
be subordinated to the whims of
Right.
the moment. And so the whole kind of Congress is the opposite of progress stuff. It's fun and bumper sticker material, but oh, by the way, what we've had over the last 100 years is Republicans and Democrats getting together to agree to massively spend and borrow beyond our means. We have $85 trillion in unfunded liabilities and debt.
And that's,
so they're doing stuff.
They're doing stuff, but let me give you an example of what I mean when I say the opposite of progress. When Barack Obama was elected, what was the first thing that Mitch McConnell said? We will do everything we can, everything in our power to make sure he's a one-term president.
Well, but that's partisan politics.
That's partisan politics. That's an issue, though, right? That's not something that I believe James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay envisioned when they were writing the Federalist Papers. And that's not something that I think represents the best of what America has to offer. So when I say Congress is the opposite of progress and we're not doing that great in that regard, I'm referring to statements like that and the fact that those statements can be reflected in a number of the actions that were taken by Republicans while Obama was in office. That doesn't mean the left was doing everything right or that Harry Reid wanted to faithfully engage all the time, right? It's on both sides. But that, I think, is an issue. I think that there is a lack of good listening, a lack of active listening, and I think we've lost that virtue of seeing, where can common ground be found. Now, politics, it's a contact sport, it's a tough business, it involves compromise, right? So, I mean, there aren't any easy answers to political polarization. I think our institutions can be better, but I think we have what it takes within the existing institutions.
So, one of the things, even though I like a lot of what you've written and said, I've seen your TED Talk and some other remarks you've given, the remarks before Congress, that 5-minute riff you went on was excellent. But it seems to me one of the main differences of opinion we would have, me and you, just philosophically, is you're still a little bit tethered to identity politics, much more so than I am, or I think is productive. I think actually identity politics, the idea of focusing so much on defining somebody by their race or their gender or their sexual disposition, is unbelievably destructive. The postmodernist construct, or you're either binary, you're either an oppressor or a victim, and there is no in between. I find very troubling, and you seem to be like, diversity. We got to make sure there's the women contingent here. We got to make sure there's a black contingent here, a Hispanic contingent.
Well, so let's talk about it. I think so. Why is it destructive? Why do you think it's destructive?
Because it's anti-intellectual, and it's anti-meritocratic.
Anti-intellectual.
It's anti-intellectual. You're black, I'm white, but our differences in race are not the sum total of the definition of each one of us respectively. And what identity politics has become, clearly, is that you are nothing more than your gender or your race, or if you want to layer in intersectionality, then you're nothing more than your gender, race, and sexual orientation. The content of your character, the content of your work product, your behavior, those are to be discarded, or at least put in a subordinate position to those identifiers.
I think that what you're describing is reflected, has been reflected in certain more radical factions. I think there's some virtues to identity politics. I actually don't really use the phrase that much. I think it oversimplifies. I think that in identifying with those who look like you, those who have similar experiences, those who face similar grievances, similar challenges, is a way of forging solidarity, right? And I think that can be very important. So, this idea that you have white culture and black culture, I think it's more complicated than that. I think they refer to things when people, use those phrases.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to go see a Denzel Washington movie anymore because I'm culturally appropriating something.
Yeah, I think that, I agree with you on that. I think that's ridiculous. I think I understand where it's coming from, but I think it's ridiculous.
But experiences. I mean, I went to Northwestern with a bunch of people that were different races and different religions, who I have nothing in common with other than I went to Northwestern with them. I certainly wouldn't want to associate with them just because we had that shared experience.
Do you know about Jonathan Haidt?
Yeah.
Okay, so he wrote a book, right, Heterodox Academy. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind.
Right.
And one of the things he explains in laying out his argument is that people are naturally tribal. And I think he's absolutely right in that we have to, especially in intellectual spaces, be wary of that, and we have to make sure that tribal instinct is not detracting from what should be robust and open discussion. At the same time, right, I think there's a reason why people are tribal. And I think there's a reason why African Americans in this country find solidarity around issues of race, around issues of inequity, around issues of inequality. And I think it has a lot to do with the history of this country. And I think that that formation of identity politics was valuable in the civil rights movement. It's valuable now. I think people who have, it's just like, heritage. People have various heritages, right? People have various traditions. And I think to unify around a common experience and say, we all believe in this, we have this shared history, can be a way of mobilizing some of the best efforts that we've seen.
I think there's a fair point there, but it quickly, as it has, I would argue, devolves into warlordocracy.
So the warlordocracy that you're referring to, I see that on the far left. I see that. I see what you're referring to, and on the far right as well. I do not think though that is a. I think it would be a bit sweeping and an overgeneralization to reduce what we call identity politics to just that. I think it's more complicated.
Well, I mean, if you know, we have a mutual friend in Bob Woodson,
Yeah.
the Woodson Center, right? And so he calls himself a solutionist, right? He's got some problems with some conservative
right.
friends, even though he's clearly conservative. And he was there for the civil rights movement, so this is somebody who has street cred on all of these issues, and he spent his life trying to help people who are disadvantaged across the racial spectrum.
And Bob Woodson identifies with those communities.
No, I understand.
When he has conferences, he makes sure that people from those communities are represented.
Because he's a solutionist. Because he's interested in addressing the issue, not prosecuting a grievance.
I agree. But he's not forgetting about where he came from.
No.
He's not forgetting about those people. You know, I disagree with Bob Woodson on some things.
I'm sure.
You know, but that in some sense, you know, when we say identity politics, what specifically are we referring to? If we're referring to racial kinship and racial solidarity, I have no problem with it. I support it. I think that racial solidarity is important. I embrace it myself. I think racial kinship is important. I think having a shared sense as an African American of African American history is very important, right? I think that it can embolden and ennoble efforts, whether you look back at the civil rights movement, whether you look at more modern efforts that have taken place, right? You know, if you look at Black Lives Matter, I think there is a lot of good there. I think that with respect to the way in which they're expressing the grievances, the way in which the police are characterized, I think, you know, I have some issues with it. But I think it's important to note that identity politics is a more nuanced conversation. I don't think it's just warlordocracy.
So then how do you react when, I mean, people who have street cred like Bob Woodson were there doing the heavy lifting in the most difficult of times, some of the most difficult times in the country's history, the run up to the Civil Rights Act of '64 and beyond? They're referred to by mainstream pals and pundits of the left as Uncle Toms because they're conservative.
I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. I think it's unfair. I think it detracts from what could be a more useful conversation about where differences are, where commonality can be found. I don't think calling somebody an Uncle Tom, what does that really achieve? It may be personally gratifying for a minute. You feel like, oh, it's a good zinger, it's a good one-liner, right?
No, it's not great.
You know, it's really not, right? No. It's overused, right? It's tired at this point. So, you know, I don't support it. I have a problem with it. If you want to say, listen, I think that what someone is doing is, you know, morally inconsistent, you know, is illogical, or, you know, is beneath their intelligence or their character, beneath who I thought them to be. That's a different kind of claim than so-and-so is an Uncle Tom or a traitor and so forth. So, you know, I think we should stay away from that language. I don't think it has a place it shouldn't have a place in serious public discourse about serious issues. And I'm personally pretty dismayed by it when I see it.
And what about people who are marginalized because they tackle issues that many on the left just don't want to have to address? So when Jason Riley at the Wall Street Journal writes about the incidence of black-on-black crime in urban centers in the context of the debate about gun control, so forth, or when Michael Javon Fortner at CCNY writes about the history of the draconian drug laws.
Yeah, James Furman Jr. has written about it too in his book, his recent book.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so,
Locking up our own.
Right, and the idea that this was some kind of white man conspiracy. No, it was actually black. You
had black political elites who were pushing the tough on crime
went
policies.
to Nelson Rockefeller. They said, "We got drugs that are ruining our neighborhoods. Do something about it."
Right.
So, but they're not really elevated, or their message is not amplified.
I agree. That's a problem. That's a problem. It's groupthink. It's confirmation bias. It reflects this. It's us versus them. You know, it goes back to if you identify with the left and you say within left circles, I am with you on the broader goal. I'm with you on the aim. But in terms of the execution, in terms of the method, in terms of the mechanisms, I have some disagreements. It's like you're out. You get the boot. That's a problem. Not in all circles, but in some. That's a problem, right? The issues that are being raised, that you raised with Fortner and with Foreman and with other scholars who've noted those things need to be said with respect to Jason, when they need to be considered because they're part of the conversation where we're talking about race and crime and the law. It's difficult because, you know, there's certain dominant narratives that we're accustomed to hearing.
Yeah, right.
And we need to complicate those narratives.
Asian Americans. Asian Americans in higher ed, there's been a bit of a revolt that's been brewing, that's not bubbled to the surface with what de Blasio wanted to do in New York with selective enrollment schools, and with this study that came out about Harvard sort of artificially rigging the system against admitting Asian Americans by uniformly lowering their kind of personality and character test scores to eliminate the disparity between a lot of Asian American applicants and applicants of other races with respect to test scores and academic credentials. Asian Americans, minority group, you know, successful, sort of culturally different. Is it okay to rig the system against Asian Americans in favor of African Americans or Latinos or even other whites in the interest of diversity? They're a minority.
So I think that affirmative action has many costs, but I think that the benefits outweigh the cost. And I think that affirmative action should take place on different vectors: gender-based, class-based, race-based, right? That is not to say that race-based affirmative action doesn't have, you know, I mean, some of the costs, for example, in trying to make sure that you have a racially diverse student body, you may end up accepting some students who get there and feel out of place. Just because you accept a student who's African American or a student who is Latino does not mean that the student is necessarily prepared to be there, right? Well, I think it's on us as a society to think about, you know, how can we help those students once they are there, and how can we make it so that more students who are African American and Latino feel as though they can be there. In terms of the way in which it affects Asian Americans, I think that's significant, and I think that's certainly a cost. I think that it affects, or it can affect, a white applicant in, you know, from a under-resourced community as well, and that's a cost. But if you look at America's history, and you look at I think what racial diversity does for us in various institutions, the importance of having it, I ultimately think that it's more beneficial than harmful to have a serious effort being made to make sure that there are African American students who are represented on campus, and then also to try to strive for a college campus that looks more like America.
So diversity is better achieved not through the natural machinations of the marketplace and a meritocratic regime, but through kind of government-directed policy. The people in government know better.
You know, I would buy into the whole meritocratic idea if I thought that there were more of a level playing field from the get-go.
Well, what's
tough for me.
What's from the get-go?
I believe in rewarding hard work now. I do. I believe in that. I think rewarding hard work is very important.
Well, you're a living example of it.
Incentivizing hard work, I think, is important. I think incentives are important. You know, I get that argument.
Well, what about the, you know, the blame, like the idea that's sort of becoming more prevalent in this whole concept of fairness, that it is more appropriate to blame somebody who's dead for your circumstances than you, the living person, charting your course in life. Sort of this, you know, level playing field from the start.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, I don't think there's a level playing field from the start for an African American who is born in Southeast DC.
Or a hillbilly from the Appalachians.
Or a hillbilly from Appalachia, right? I even think those two experiences are different, and we should acknowledge those differences. But both are starting in places in which they do not have the resources. They do not have the familial stability, the financial stability or the affluence that so many of my peers had when I went to a private school. But I mean, there are costs. When you're talking about affirmative action, there are significant costs, right? But I think if we look at what it does on the positive end, you know, more African Americans have degrees, right? They are better prepared, better able to. You gain something when you're at Williams College. Even if you get there and you're struggling, you gain something from being at Williams College, right? I want to see more African Americans, more Latinos, more have an opportunity to make the most of that education. to gain what they can from it and then go out in the world and use it to make a difference.
No, I mean, look, I agree with the end game, which I think we have a bit of a disagreement about how best to get there the quickest. But what about how this works out in our increasingly multiracial society? So Shelby Steele's son, Eli, just made this documentary. Well, he made it about a year ago, but it's getting more traction. How Jack Became Black. It's a documentary about him enrolling his son in the LA public school system. Okay. So Eli Steele, his son, is black, white, Native American, Mexican, and Jewish, because of his family's unique ancestry, right? And so the whole point was, LA school system is making me check a box for my kid. So which box should I check? Which is more important? As part of his very diverse, all wrapped into this one little boy heritage, and it's a fascinating look. And I think now he said, I think according to his documentary, something on the order of 13 to 15% of all marriages in America today are multiracial. So increasingly multiracial society. It's going to be only more multiracial as the next couple of generations. So how does that work in the context of all of this?
Yeah, I mean,
is that what intersectionality is for? For everybody's going to get an intersectionality score?
You know, so I mean, I think it's an important observation, right? I mean, that there are people out there who, which box do I check, and why does the box matter? In what way should the box matter, right? Well, if you are African American, if people see you, when they see you, they think you are black, or when they see you, they think you are Latino. It is likely that there are certain assumptions that might be made, certain preconceived notions that might be held. It's likely that there are going to be, your experience in elite, predominantly white institutions is going to be different, right? And so that is, we can have conversations there. We should be having conversations there. Microaggressions, bias incidents. I don't think these things are being handled correctly on campus, but I do think that they point to something that needs to be taken seriously.
With you graduating from Williams, is Uncomfortable Learning, that student group, is that continuing on?
You know, I hope to continue my advocacy. I hope the group will continue. There's one tough issue about that. Williams is a small place. It's tough when you're in the hot water. And there have been a number of people who have shown me that they're interested in being a part of it and want to be a part of it. But when the going gets tough and everybody's pointing the finger at you, then, hey, you know.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, though, with affirmative action, right, and with respect to diversity, what do you think is the best way to achieve it?
Oh, sort of what I intimated in my loaded question.
Right. So meritocracy.
I mean, I think it's look, the same way that people make judgments about other people. I mean, over the real long-term substantive judgments about other people in real life, which is based on how you behave, not what you look like. I mean, so there's always, you know. Look,
what about people who are starting in very different places? What do we do?
You're never going to get. We're never all going to start in Bel Air.
It's not that we all should start in Bel Air, but that, you know, how do we increase social mobility? How do we make it so that the differences are that more people have what they need? Not everything they want. More people have what they need.
Well, I mean, you know, this again goes back to kind of root causes of the societal ills that we see before us. You'd mentioned familial stability, and by extension, financial stability. How has the welfare state and the growth of government served poor people over the last 50 years? I think horribly. Your fellow alumnus, Bill Bennett, said the federal government has never raised a child in America and never will, and he's right. And the more that we allow governments to intervene between mom and dad and kid, the worse it gets for mom and dad and kid and for all of us societally, because I hate to break it to people, but there's this idea that there's a group of people in these bureaucracies of the federal government or state governments or local government that to have some secret knowledge about how society should be ordered and know better for you how this should work out for you than you do in an environment that is rooted in beneficial exchanges based on persuasion, not coercion, which the government is force. They don't have that secret knowledge. They just have force. And they make all kinds of mistakes, and because they are so big and so powerful, their mistakes are amplified exponentially over the negative interaction that me and somebody else may have on any issue. I mean, I think that politicians are generally demagogues on both sides. So their interest is in inflaming tensions and passions, making people irrationally scapegoat other people. And then we're saying more power. That's who we need to lean on a little bit more, rather than me and you and everybody else you interact on a daily basis, and me and everybody else I act on a daily basis. I've never had an incident in my personal life over race, over gender. I mean, other than on a date, she didn't like me. But that's not really a gender issue. Or sexual orientation, or any of these other identifiers that we obsess about. It's absurd. It is absolutely the wrong way to think about human interaction. And the results are in, man. I mean, the results are in. The Great Society has been an unmitigated catastrophe. And it's one of the reasons why, oh, by the way, and this is just the data, the last time the black unemployment rate was lower than the white unemployment rate was 1932. So at the height of institutional government-directed racism. Now compare that to the intervening, since the New Deal to the Great Society forward. All that politicians do is look for, generally speaking, there are a few exceptions. There's always a few statesmen in each generation, but a few. The real play is to make people dependent on you, because that is the source to aggrandizing your power or keeping yourself in power. And that's what politicians on both sides do, and that's what the welfare state has done. So the idea of growing that cancer, all it does is inflict more sickness and impose more death. I really believe a cultural death. And I think that's what you're seeing happen. I mean, how do you otherwise explain the destruction of not just the black family, most pronouncedly the black family, but the illegitimacy rate in Latino and white, and the sort of kind of Caligula culture that we've embraced? This is bad news.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a few. I mean, William Julius Wilson's a sociologist at Harvard who he's most famous for his book, The Declining Significance of Race, but he's written a number of others. And he's talked about the absence of, or not the absence, the disappearance of jobs, blue-collar jobs, factory jobs, right? He's talked about the family and social institutions and what's happening there. He's talked about the fact that there's certain structural impediments, but also certain cultural problems. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I don't agree with the characterization. I see it a bit differently. I think the government should play a role. I mean, that is, in terms of providing greater opportunity, whether it's with respect to education or jobs training program, or thinking about how can we reorient our economy to have more jobs in various sectors, I think the government's got to play a role there. But where I think I can see what you're saying is with respect to, there is a sense in which, dependency is a real thing, right? There's a sense in which incentives have to matter. So how can you preserve those incentives, right? And at the same time, make sure that those who really do need a helping hand, right? This whole pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Well, it's been said, Martin Luther King said this. How are you supposed to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps if you don't have boots? Right? So I want to make sure more people have boots. I think the government's got to play a role there, right? And I'm not saying we needs to be overreach. I think it's the way in which I think about what the government can do economically to help people is similar to regulation. I think certain regulations are imperative, but I don't think we need to overregulate. Some of the deregulation work Reagan did was important, right? I thought some of it had harmful effects, but some of it was important. I think we should regulate effectively, right? But enterprise is important. So I think things have to be done. We should look at the evidence. And to the point of Johnson, though, if you look at the beginning of his presidency and the end and the efforts of the Great Society, poverty actually went down from about 19.6 to 13.3. So I'd love to know how you explain that one.
That's like Nancy Pelosi saying unemployment benefits are a stimulus. That's a short-term injection of capital that creates long-term dependency. That's trading away your soul, because dependency is soul-crushing, for 30 pieces of silver. That's a bad deal.
It's a bad deal.
That is a bad deal.
I don't know.
Do you think 100 million people on some form of food support program right now in this country? 100 million people. That's almost a third of the population. You think that's a good outcome?
I guess the thing that I think is, if it's that they have food or they don't, I'd rather see that many people on food stamps. If it's people don't have food or the government's providing assistance, I think the government should provide assistance.
These are shibboleths. Nobody in America starves to death.
Well,
it's like getting hit by a train. The only way you get hit by a train is if you want to get hit by a train.
No, I don't. I disagree. It's
pretty, but yeah. No, that pretty much is true.
If you're incarcerated and you go back out into society and you can't get a job, right? I mean, there are people who are struggling, and it's not a matter of personal will. It's not a matter of personal responsibility. It's a matter of inequity. It is difficult for them to re-enter society as a citizen who wants to contribute and make a difference.
And here's
that's a structural issue.
Here's something else. Here's something else that's a structural data point, which you know, and it'd be interesting to see if you admit to, which is here's 99% chance of never living in poverty. And I'm not talking about starving. I'm talking about how we define poverty. Like you only have 2 cell phones and 1 satellite dish. A 99% chance of never living in poverty. Graduate high school.
Yeah, I've heard this. Get married.
Don't commit a crime.
Don't have kids till you're married, right?
Don't have kids till you're married. And and the fourth is get a job, any job. Back to Dr. King. If you're a street sweeper, be the Michelangelo of street sweeping. Get into the economy and work your way up, because you work your ass off doing something, even if it's menial, it's going to lead to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And of course, the stories in America of that are legion. So
I like all those factors. I think they're important.
Right. So is that too much to ask of every American citizen?
Can I tell you why? I'm going to tell you why. I think we should strive for that. I think it's important. I think leaders in communities, whether it's at Boys and Girls Clubs, whether it's at churches, whether it's city councilmen, they should be promoting that kind of message that's important, right? I mean, I think it's important to think about government at a municipal and local level as well. But I would say that there are sociocultural influences. There's psychosocial factors in poor communities, under-resourced communities, that make it very difficult for that 6-year-old to grow up in such a way that they're going to be able to realize the values you're describing.
Well, I know, and
when they don't have
the government's exacerbated all of those problems and marginalized those role models. But here's the thing, and this is the part that's not discussed: the idea of kind of like the marketplace or the government.
Yeah.
Included in the marketplace, are the platoons of democracy that Burke and de Tocqueville wrote about. Mm-hmm. All those civic, voluntary organizations and associations that make America different than any other country, the church and the Boys and Girls Club and this local charity and the local food pantry, they're all privately run and community-based, that this is the way to deal with people that are struggling in the short to medium term. This is the way to amplify and elevate role models, people that devote their lives to the service of other people, whether it's the clergy or the teacher or the school resource officer or whoever. So there's this other whole infrastructure that's sort of under-discussed and produces much better results at much lower costs than do centralized bureaucracies.
I agree. I think I would like to think about ways in which the private sector can play a role in addressing and certain social issues, certain concerns. Michael Porter is a scholar at the business school at Harvard, and he's written about
5 forces.
Yeah, 5 forces, exactly. But he's given a talk, a very important talk, where he talks about how can we use business to solve problems. I think that's very important. The issue I have with the idea
Don't tell Bernie Sanders
that is enough alone is that I don't think, right? It goes back to what Madison said, right? I don't think people are angels. That's not to say I don't think there are a lot of good people in the world, and that people don't fundamentally have a capacity for good. But I think we're in a capitalist democracy.
Right.
It is competitive, and people are naturally self-interested. I don't think it's enough to just say that private charity will lead to, people will help because they want to help. I think some people will. But I think the government's got to do something, especially when there are institutional and structural barriers there.
Well, if I could channel Milton Friedman for a moment here. Right, men are not angels. So who are these angels that are going to come down to run government for us? The Soviet commissar, you don't think he's self-interested? The American politician? The director of such and such agency, alphabet soup cabinet position? You think they're not self-interested? You think they're not greedy? You think that they're better than their average man in or woman in the private sector? No.
No, I don't think they're any better at all. I think
why concentrate power in their hands? Why not diffuse power across the system?
So I think I believe in the institutions that we have, and I think that if you look at FDR, if you look at LBJ, I think that there were a number of great things that were accomplished under the New Deal and the Great Society. I think if you look at employment, some of the employment numbers, you see that. I mean, if you look at the Fair Housing Act, you look at the Voting Rights Act, if you look at these things, those were legislative efforts that were made using the mechanisms within our democratic institutions.
Are you even allowed to utter
difference.
Are you even allowed to utter those acronyms, FDR and LBJ, these days on the left? One in turn to the Japanese, and LBJ with virulent racist. I mean, you can't speak about these past presidents in polite conversation, can you?
It can be tough. It can be. I mean, it can be tough because it's sometimes with some people it's Bernie or the high road, right? It's like are you feeling the burn? If you're not feeling the burn,
yeah,
get out.
But I tell you, that's no problem. I hope this book makes a lot of money because I don't know how welcome you're going to be on the left in the modern context. You're going to have to turn a lot of things around culturally. What's going on in your side of the Maginot line there. He is Zach Wood. The book is Uncensored. Zach, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book. It's been a lot of fun. I love the conversation. You're a super smart guy. I know you're going to be running for office or be appointed some kind of intergalactic czar or something like that. So I'm just glad to get in on the ground floor with you. And I appreciate the time.
I appreciate it, Dan.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.